Welcome to week 4, everyone. This week, we're going to be discussing Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which was published in 1722. So in that regard, we're continuing to explore the historical representations of and experiences of illness. We began that exploration in medieval Florence by reading Boccaccio's Decameron. We then moved to Renaissance England, where we read John Donne, his Devotions upon Emergent Occasions. And with this book, we're going to be moving from the Renaissance into the 18th century, which is 1700 to about 1799, or actually inexplicably about 1660 into about 1850. Before we get started, if you haven't had a chance to, I would recommend that you watch the two videos that I have put up online in this lecture file. One is a recreation of the streets of medieval London in about 1665. So it would have been the same year, roughly, as the topic of this book. The second is a recreated soundscape of Paris in the 18th century, which will just give you a sense of what it might have sounded like to walk through the streets. And the reason why I suggest this is that it will really enrich your reading of the Journal of the Plague Year by giving a sense of how people experienced the streets where they were walking and the sounds that they were hearing. I have to be honest, I've studied 18th century literature and Renaissance literature for probably about 20 years. I ran across these two videos a few years ago, and they helped to kind of fill out the details for me and give me a sense of how the 18th century would have looked and sounded and felt in a way that I sort of wasn't quite able to get from my reading. All right, so let's start talking about Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year specifically. It's a really difficult text to pin down, and if you were confused while you're reading it, you are not alone. It's a complex and seemingly unstructured text. First of all, it's a novel, right? It's a work of fiction, but it's actually documenting a real historical event, and it reads like a documentary. At the same time, it's titled as a journal, as though it's a personal memoir. And then, in addition, it doesn't really have a very obvious narrative structure. When we typically read novels, we get a narrator who tells us a story with very few digressions. The story begins, there's a kind of conflict, the conflict develops, reaches a crescendo point, and then it resolves. But in this story, the narrator, whose name is HF, so we don't even know his name, we just know his initials, HF sort of meanders through the story. He travels from street to street. He'll begin to tell a story, and then he'll recall something and sort of digress into that. He'll be telling us a story, and he'll become really obsessed with details, and then he'll gloss over other details. He'll seamlessly go into the bills of mortality and the various, various advertisements, and that relates to, in part, not just the way that he's structuring the tale, but also his mode of storytelling. We typically read in novels one narrator's rendering of the story, maybe with some dialogue thrown in. But in this story, HF relies on a variety of different ways of telling us this story. He witnesses things directly that he then tells us about. He talks to people, and he also hears things. So he reports back to us gossip and stories and rumors. He also weaves in bills of mortality from the parishes, public health records, government documents, and advertisements for different quack medicines. And the effect of that is that you get a story that's incredibly detailed. It's actually fairly precise in how it's being rendered, and yet it's very disorganized as a reader. So it's kind of hard to understand what's going on temporally, like in terms of the epidemic itself, and then also what's going on in terms of the story. There's no conflict and resolution. All right, so let's get a little bit of facts on Journal of the Plague Year as a publication, and also on Defoe himself. So the Journal of the Plague Year was published in 1722, and it recalls the last great plague to sweep London in 1665. That means that this story was written 57 years after the plague had actually swept London. Now, the plague was one of two calamities that affected London in a 2-year period. First is the plague itself in 1665. London just gets over that, and in 1666, it experiences a great fire, which burns down 4/5 of the medieval center of the city in 3 days. And that medieval center is most of where HF, the narrator, is walking around. So the effect of these two events is really traumatic. And the only analogy that I could think of is, how you would feel if Chicago experienced something like the avian flu or some kind of pandemic that wiped out an enormous number of the population, and then just a few months later experienced a fire that wiped out the entire downtown. And the reason why I mention these two things is that Defoe himself was alive when they occurred. Defoe, we think, was born in 1660 in London to James and Alice Foe. He added the "duh" later on when he was an adult to make his name sound more distinguished. The Foes were tallow chandlers. They made candles for a living. So his parents are a part of that artisanal working class, much like HF, who's a saddler. He makes saddles. Now, Defoe would have been, I think, 5 years old during the plague, and from what we can tell, he was evacuated from London. So the author lived during the plague, but he was not a direct observer of it. At the same time, he had family and friends that were directly affected by it and would have talked about it. Now, professionally, Defoe held a number of jobs throughout his life. He was a merchant of many types of goods. He traveled widely throughout Europe, although his home base was always London. He was in the army for a while. He was a journalist. He published pamphlets on a variety of topics. He was actually in and out of prison a couple of times. Once for bankruptcy, he went into debt. He became bankrupt. And then another time he was held in prison for seditious libel for one of the pamphlets that he published. But he's also really well known as a novelist. He published several extremely popular novels. His most famous novel is Robinson Crusoe, which was published in 1719. Now, he's writing in an era where the novel is just beginning to modernize. Prior to this period, novels tended to be extremely long, 1,000-page long works of romances that oftentimes dealt with situations and people that just were outside of the realm of normal readers. So long prose romances in the Middle Ages might have dealt with kings and queens, other members of the aristocracy, gods and goddesses. But beginning in the 18th century, novels begin to increasingly concern themselves with the lives of ordinary people like tallow chandlers and saddlers. And because they become more interested in kind of middle-class readers, they also become more realistic. That is, that authors try to create a believable world that their readers can identify with and believe in. And so that may help you to kind of understand both the disjointedness of Journal of the PlagueYr and also its really, sort of existent examination of the poor and middle class. Now, here's some things to keep in mind as you're reading through the Journal of the PlagueYr. First of all, you probably know that the city is suffering from the plague, as did Florence in Boccaccio's Decameron. In fact, they're suffering from what we believe to be the exact same plague, which is bubonic plague. As we discussed last time, this plague is caused by infected fleas who live on rodents, and people get sick when those fleas bite them. And this may account for why HF sees the plague sort of spreading from parish to parish. What might be occurring is that the rats that have those fleas that are biting people are actually leaving those areas as there's less and less food available as people get sick and going into other areas, which is why the plague is spreading. And what HF is cataloging is a plague that's taking on a couple of different forms. One is a kind where you just don't know that you're sick. Maybe you have the sniffles and then suddenly you drop down dead, like in the middle of the street. The more common type that he's describing is where you kind of get sick with flu-like symptoms and then begin to see what he calls tokens or buboes, which are actually swollen lymph nodes. Your lymph nodes get very hard and swollen. So those tokens appear around your neck, your armpits, and your groin. Now, HF is pretty insistent that he does not know what causes the plague, and he certainly doesn't from an etiological perspective. So he gives us a few different theories. One is he mentions on page 3 that the plague comes from Holland, so he knows it has a kind of geographical origin. On 33, he mentions that he believes that the plague comes from God. So he has a kind of religious understanding of the plague as well, as being a sort of test from heaven, though it's clear that that belief may coexist with other beliefs in the plague. On page 72, he talks about a contagion theory, the idea that the plague is spread by some kind of like breath that can enter from one person to another. And that's similar to another theory that he has, which we see on page 73, where he talks about the plague being spread by what he calls effluvia. That would be a kind of like warm, vaporous air. And that is probably one of the more prevalent theories that we would see in works in this period about the plague. The idea that it's being spread by bad air. In particular, the air from sick people, the air from things that the sick people have touched, and the air from dead bodies, which is in part why you have this, strong effort to try and get all dead bodies removed from their homes and buried in some kind of pit. And then the final theory that he espouses is on 73, where he says that the plague is spread by tiny little insects. It's actually not that far from what actually is spreading the plague. It's a continental theory. He himself seems to kind of reject it. So here's what HF does know about the plague. He knows that it can affect people very quickly. He knows it's extremely lethal. And he knows what signs to look for, those tokens that he talks about. At the same time, though, he also knows a kind of terrifying reality, which is that while you can quarantine people that have those tokens on them, there is a period in which they don't have the tokens, but they're still sick. So you could still be infected by them, but you won't know it. So you just don't know who's sick, who's around you. Now, he knows that there are some people that can recover from the plague. He talks about that if people have a very sudden onset of those buboes and then they break and drain, that they will get better. But he also knows those are few and far between. The majority of people are going to die of the plague. And he warns people that the best way to avoid the plague is to run away from it. The other thing that he knows and he records, which is so interesting in his text, is the way that the plague puts public health efforts in direct confrontation with personal health efforts. And by this I mean that the plague obviously is affecting individual people, right, and individual households. At the same time, the magistrates who run the government in London have to put in place a public health effort to try and contain the plague. And these two things come in conflict with each other. First, magistrates need people to clean up the streets. They need them to clean up the streets of, in particular, of dead bodies, to transport those bodies to wide open pits where they can be buried, and possibly to transport some of those bodies to what's called the pest house, which is the hospital for plague victims. That obviously puts people that are working in those carts in direct harm's way. At the same time, the magistrates are trying to quarantine people, and what they'll do is if a member of your household ends up having those tokens of plague, they will shut up the entire house. I think it's for 2 months. So what's happening to people that Defoe is describing is they might have like a servant or a child or maybe someone who's boarding in their house that comes down with the plague, and they end up being shut in with them, by the magistrates, and that becomes a certain death sentence because they know that the plague is going to travel through their household. So, people are being pitted against the magistrates because they're eager to get out and to be free. Now, this journal seems to be a kind of really weird mishmash of both musings and data. As I said before, it doesn't seem to have a lot of structure, but there actually is a structure to it. And the first is a kind of geographical structure. So I want you to pay attention as you're reading to this first thing, this geographical structure. The author actually takes you down the streets of London. If you look on the back of the book, there's actually a map of London in about 1665. What you'll notice is that the city is divided into, I believe, like 92 different parishes. And inside those parishes are going to be different streets. London itself is also divided into a series of quadrants. The author is primarily traversing the medieval middle of that city. Now, that medieval middle is not a gridded city, all right? It's a series of intertwining alleyways, tiny little streets, somewhat larger thoroughfares. There's really no rhyme nor reason to how these streets are put together. There's no block names, right? There's no street names anywhere. There's also no street addresses. People in this period didn't have an address the way that we do. They would tell you where they lived, in geographical location to something else. They live close to some, usually it's to some larger structure of the city. I live this close to Cripplegate. I live this close to, this churchyard. And in addition, the streets are really, really narrow. So when you're walking down the street, it might be so narrow that it only allows passersby, or maybe it only allows like carts to go down one at a time. All right. In addition, houses are really close together. These are wooden houses. They're very close together. They can be pretty high. The rooftops sometimes will end up blocking sunlight. And the people in these cities, they're really, really populous in these streets. Now, the effect of this architecture is that on a normal day, there's going to be a ton of hustle and bustle, and also a cacophony of noises, of people walking around, of cartwheels, of horses, people hawking their wares, various animals going around. And because those streets are so narrow, it's actually going to be even louder than you and I might experience in our own streets, which are actually fairly wide. Now, to be able to traverse this city, you really, really have to know it. There's no addresses, there's no street signs. The streets are like spaghetti. All right? And HF knows this city. He knows it really, really well, all right, from a geographical perspective. But the problem is that this city is rendered completely unfamiliar to him because it is so changed by the plague. So as you're reading, I want you to think about how he records those changes. I mean, he notices that the city's emptied out. He also notices a lot of new sounds, or differences of sounds, and he notices different flora and fauna. So pay attention to those details. In addition to a kind of geographic structure that we see to this book, there's also a character structure that overlays it. And I mean this in 3 different ways. One, London itself almost becomes a type of character, right? So, HF records the effect of the illness on the city, in particular on the quality of its sights and sounds. So pay attention to those sounds. What is he hearing as he walks through the streets? Does he hear wagons? Does he hear voices? Are those voices attached to people that he's running into, or are they like disembodied voices? Pay attention as well to the geography and the architecture of the city. What streets does he traverse? And how different are they from what he normally experiences? How does the plague actually change the way that the cityscape looks? And then also pay attention to interior spaces, exterior spaces, and liminal spaces. By interior and exterior, here's what I mean. We tend to think of our home as being a private space from the outside world. And then the street is a public space. How does the plague change this? And what I mean by liminal spaces are spaces that really are not on the outside, nor are they particularly on the inside. So things like thresholds and doorways and windows. How often does HF record what's going on at thresholds, at doorways, at windows? How many times does he mention these? A good thing to do is to look for patterns. There's another character in this book, that's HF himself, right? HF is a narrator, but he's also a character. He has a kind of psychology that's being recorded in this book. So what kind of character is he? And why is he telling the story in the way that he's telling it? We know that he's very careful about his sources and about telling us how to read his sources. He tells us when bills of mortality are corrupt. He tells us when he's heard rumors. He's told us when he sees things so he can verify them. And then, in addition, he seems to have a series of kind of internal conflicts that are occurring within the story. First, he can't decide to evacuate versus staying. And then he seems to be continuously falling into this pattern of wanting to stay inside to keep himself safe, but then sort of feeling compelled to go outside. Why and what is he being compelled by? And here's the third set of characters. It's these minor characters that we meet by chance. The waterman who is trying to protect his family. The drunkard that gets accidentally added to the dead card. There's the woman who loses her daughter. There's the women who steal the hats. How do those those tiny characters that he runs into, how do they operate within the text? So what I'm asking you to do, in essence, is to begin close reading. To do this, what I want you to do is think about the things that I've mentioned. I want you to examine and gather evidence from the text in the form of quotations, in the form of words that you're seeing, image patterns. And I want you to think about how that evidence operates to create meaning. Does the evidence work symbolically in terms of things like thresholds or city streets? What do they tell us about the experience of plague? What do they tell us about what's happening to London? Why is the author creating imagery? Is he creating, a lot of sound? And why is he doing that? And that's the next thing that you do when you close read. You begin to think about not only how does your evidence work, but what is the effect of that evidence? Another way to think about that is to ask yourself, why has the author chosen to include this evidence? Is it meant to, in the case of Journal of PlagueYr, is his evidence meant to make us feel horrified, to make us experience what he's feeling? Is it to educate us? Is it to invoke an emotional response? Is it to render a judgment on the magistrates? All right, I want you to keep those things in mind. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will look forward to talking with you on the discussion board.